So, my first question, where are all the horse trainers?
I don't know. No, I think that when it comes to the metaphor itself, every one of us should understand at her or his level that we have to deal with politics. When anyone, I keep on repeating this, but once, some Salafi literalists came to me and saying we have to avoid politics. Politics has nothing to do with Islam. We have to follow the leaders the way they are because this is God's will and that's it. And by saying we should not be involved in politics, my answer was, but this is politics. When you refuse to be involved in politics, this is politics in itself. So it's a decision. This is when, as a human being, we have a conscience and we are aware of our responsibility, we are already in the world of politics. It's governance for ourselves. It starts with ourselves. So the horse is very much in us when we become aware. And then it's a collective thing, is understanding that not only we live for ourselves, but we have to serve a community. And the community is not only Muslims. The community is, as Imam al-Nawawi was saying, al-ukhuwa al-insaniyya, is this human brotherhood that we are sharing, is in which way you are serving and useful for the human community. And the human community is another hadith from al-Bayhaqi, which is reported and is authentic. The best among you is the best for human beings, for all the human beings. This is politics. This is the starting point of serving. And the right governance is not to govern and to be served by the people, but it's the way you serve the people. So I would say that we should avoid thinking about politics as something which is far from our daily life. It's very much about standing for our principles. And in fact, let me put it that way, because in the horse metaphor, there is something that we don't get. In fact, the first attitude of human being, if you want to go towards right and good governance, you always start by resisting. And the very first understanding of jihad is not, only effort. I think that to live is to go throughout a jihad. And jihad means two things: resisting and reforming. Resisting and reforming is politics. Resisting what is bad, al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, is to resist what is bad and to reform to what is good. This is our daily life on an individual basis and a collective basis. And we need to understand this. The starting point of our life with God is resistance, and resistance means courage. Courage by doing what? Looking at the situation, looking at our own failures, looking at what the society is doing. So, for example, if you are in the UK, you have to start resisting to all the injustices in yourself and all the injustices within the society. And what you have to do is to change this for the better. So my understanding of Islam and my understanding of what it means to be a human being is to what are you resisting and in which way you are reforming. And I will know which kind of human being you are. This is Islamic, but this is universal at the same time.
So, when we talk about societal reformation, you're saying that we need to begin with, are you saying we need to begin with personal reformation? Is it one and then the other, or can we do both at the same time?
No, I would say we have to do both at the same time. Because this is, you learn from, there is something which is very strange in the way you read it in the Quran, and then you understand that this is common to all the spiritualities. The spiritualities are not telling you in the Hindu tradition, the Buddhist tradition, the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, the Muslim tradition, and even sometimes in some of in the Marxist tradition, they are saying something which is very interesting. In fact, you don't start with yourself and then you go to the world. In fact, it's your interaction with the world which is bringing you back to yourself. And you have a verse saying this. سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. We are going to show them our signs in the horizon and in themselves. So you look first outside and it came back to you. And this is exactly the way we have to do, we should deal with our society. In fact, we deal with our society, how are we going to, who can experience something which has to do with selfishness? Do you just sit down, you look at yourself during the night and say, I'm selfish, and my ego is big? No. It's your ego is going to be perceived as big in the way you interact with others. You can feel that, yes, it's quite, I have a problem here. How are you going to deal with your own lack of generosity? You don't sit down and say, okay, I'm not generous. It's from the others that, and this is where in politics, in governance, in anything which has to do with our life, it's not I transform myself and go to the world. No, I go to the world and I transform myself by dealing with the world. The world is sending me messages, and this is the way we have to deal with this. So if you want to test the lack of courage that you may have, it's not going to come during the night. It's going to come, because even here, as I'm always saying, in evening, and to feel that you are courageous, that's easy. Courage is not here. Courage is in your daily life, in the way you deal with power, with authority, in the way you deal with this. So it's not one and then the other. It's always the two together. And when we have the hadith al-iman yazidu wa yanqus, that faith is increasing and decreasing, وَيُصَدِّقُهُ الْعَمَلِ, it's going to be confirmed through your action. So action is outward, and then it comes back to your spirituality inwards. So you test the inward level of your ethical attitude through the way you deal with people outside. So I wouldn't at all, repeat what I get from some people by saying, educate yourself first, and then you come back to the activities. I think it's going together.
Okay, that's good, inshallah. Okay, so you talked about naql and having scripture and revelation as a guiding force. And then we have on the other side aql, our intellects and our rational deduction. And then you sort of alluded to what we call the knuckle heads. The ones who, the ones who are staying onto scripture and who are literalists and who are imposing those ideas. How do we counter that narrative? And why is it such an appealing narrative?
Yes, so let me start with the last question and come back inductively to the first one. Because I think that, three things are important. When you feel that you are losing your principles and you don't know how do you deal with the surrounding world, it's clear that the text is going to protect you. Say, it's written, so I follow this. So the text is perceived in times of crisis as a reference and a protective reference. And that's normal. It's normal to come to the text because you need to be protected from the world. Now, the problem is the way you come back to the text is not to come back to the text. I would say as believers, we all agree we have to come back to the text. The problem is how do you come back to the text and how do you deal with the context and the surrounding society. The second is that for some people, when you quote the text, the fact that you quote the text, it's giving you an answer, and this binary vision is a very simple quote of the text is giving you a protection. Say, okay, the text is saying this. You don't have to think about it. This is why with some Salafi literalists, when you are talking with them, they are very quick to come to the conclusion by quoting the text. And it's as if, oh no, I'm not using my mind. I'm just quoting the text. I say, I'm sorry, to quote is to decide. To quote is to interpret the text. But they are very quick, and in this black and white, it's the text against, innovation and people thinking on their own. And this is very attractive because it gives you a very simple answer to a question, and you have now people interpreting everything which is happening in the Middle East, for example, by quoting the Quran and say, it's written already. I say, okay, so if it's written, it's black and white, and that's it. So the less you open the door to interpretations, the more comfortable you feel because the text is saying this. So this is the second one. And the third is something which has to do with the Muslim psychology today is, once again, all what I was saying on the defensive mode is the less exposed you are to critical thinking, the more confident you feel with with the universe of reference. So the way we are and it's not exactly the same as being literalist. It's very much the way we are dealing with our reference as something which is protecting us from any critical discussion. Now, having said that, today, what is important is to understand the psychology. I don't like some of the students and teachers and leaders' attitude towards the ordinary Muslims, looking down at them, saying, okay, look, this is just... No, I think we have first very sophisticated minds who are literalists, and we have to respect this. I don't have a problem if it's for yourself. I respect this, and to be a literalist conservative, I don't have a problem with this. So this kind of arrogant position that I think you don't, it's the starting point of an unethical stand with some of our trends within Islam. We have to respect this. Now, having said this, it doesn't mean that we have to accept this. We should be critical by saying, I don't agree with your conclusions. I don't agree with the way you deal with the scriptural sources. And this is where, in the Islamic tradition, it's not new in the discussion that we have now. We had people, it's known in Al-Ash'ariyya, it's one of the Islamic trends, saying, in fact, what we have to do when it comes to ethics, and this comes to you, the questions that you just asked me just after the talk, is they were saying the ethical reference is, all our ethical references are coming from the text. So if Allah, God is saying this is coming from the text, we have to refer to this. The Mu'tazila is another trend saying, no, it's coming from the text, but our mind is producing ethics as well. It's producing, can produce morality and ethical values. In the light of what the text is saying, we have the way, and in itself, there is something which is morality is and should be intellectually explained. It cannot just only referring to the text. In between, we have another trend in Maturidiyya. It's another trend saying, no, it's in between. It's between al-naql wal-aql. It's between the text and the human intellect. And at the end, what the Islamic tradition is saying here, the mainstream, but not only, we have many trends here, is to say ethics is, of course, from a religious viewpoint, of course, ethics is produced by the religious reference, but not only. Human intellect can produce ethical values that are going to be overlapping with things that we find in the scriptural sources. So this is why, for example, when someone is coming and coming from a secular background and saying, there is something that I'm not going to discuss, which is the dignity of human being. From a religious viewpoint, we completely agree with this. Why? Because we find in the Quran, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We gave dignity to human being. So on this, you come from different roots, but you come to the center with the same shared values. This is what I was explaining in a book called A Philosophy of Pluralism, The Quest for Meaning, saying we have different roots coming to the same ethical principles, and we can find here that they are rational, they are religious, they are spiritual, and at the same time they are shared, and this is possible.
Okay, so that reminded me of the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said he has come to perfect noble character. So the question is, do we operate within a mainstream? Do we seek to perfect democracy? Is that our vision, or are we going to be working in a different paradigm?
Yes, something which should be understood by the Muslims and also our fellow citizens. There is this saying by the Prophet, peace be upon him, saying, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِيُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمِ الْأَخْلَاقِ. I was sent but to complete, to beautify, to just come with all the good characters that are needed for human being. But by saying this, implicitly what is said is these ethical values were here before. So he comes just to complete, not to start again the whole thing. Meaning that in history, coming from the other monotheistic traditions or other human cultures and experiences, we can find ethical values that were there, but Islam is coming just to confirm and to add sometimes things that were not there in the previous tradition. So it's very much saying There are common grounds, there are common values. So when it comes to democracy, for example, I would say from the starting point in our discussion on democracy, I would just advise all of us, Muslims or people of other faiths, just to be clear on what we are talking about when we talk about democracy. Democracy, when people are saying it's a universal value, they say, I'm sorry, democracy is a historical model. It's not a value. Democracy is a model. So the model is based on principles. I want to discuss the principles. I'm not going to fall into the trap by saying, oh, it's a universal model. No, it's not a universal model. It's, by the way, if you look at all the democracies in the West, even in Europe, we have as many models as countries in the West. So it's not a universal value. It's not a universal model. These are models based on common principles. And what I have tried to do is let us come to the principles and then discuss the models. And the principles are, I always repeat the 6 principles that we have. It's rule of law, equal citizenship, universal suffrage, accountability, separation of power, and the distinction between the authority of the state and the authority of religion. Which, by the way, as Muslims, we don't have a problem with this. We never had a church imposing onto the state. We don't have this. It might be that the Islamic reference could play a role, but to say that the ulama should be the head of the states, we never had this as a discussion, this discussion that we don't make a difference between these two authorities, it's as if you were saying there is no difference between al-mu'amalat wal-ibadat. In Islam, there is a difference between our relationship to God and our relationship to the head of state, and there is something which is coming on from on high when it comes to the religious authority and the negotiated authority when it comes to politics. This is the very essence of shura. So we don't have a problem with these 6 principles. So as someone who is dealing with my tradition, I say, I would find these principles, and I would add to these principles things that have to do with ethics, transparency, no corruption, as something which has to do with ethics in politics. But when we discuss democracy, I would go for, okay, let us agree on the principles that are indisputable. I don't have a problem with these 6 principles. Now, as someone who is dealing with democratic models, what I have to do as a citizen, what I have to do as a Muslim citizen, and what I have to do as an atheist citizen or a Christian citizen is to bring these principles and to say, what is important today is the consistency between these principles and their implementation in our societies. And we'll see that this is where we should improve democracy, as I was saying. All these principles are good, but when you have economic powers and transnational corporation taking over anything which has to do with the power of the state, you have questions to ask. When corruption is everywhere, when, for example, you have lobbies who are deciding within the parliament what is going to be the future, decisions, political decisions, you have to be critical. So as someone who is when I was writing the book about the Arab awakening, people were saying, oh, should we follow in the footsteps of the West? So should the Arab democracies or the new Arab democracies follow the Western democracies? I say, look, I'm a Western citizen. I would never advise the South to do what we are doing in the North, because our democracies are going through very deep crisis. And the first one is about economic power. The second one is about populism. Populism, emotional politics. When you get the media in our societies, you can get the people. It's just send around something which has to do with fears, with to frighten the people, and you will get them. And at the end, that's all good that we have elections, and we have to celebrate the election in the United States of America, but we all know it's a question of money. You don't have money, you will never be a president in the country. It's as simple as this. So when, for example, Barack Obama, just before he was elected a few years ago, he told us, Guantanamo, it's over, it's everything, and then he's not talking about this, and he will never speak in a clear way about Palestine. It's not because he doesn't want to do so. He can't. It's simply impossible. Why? Because the people who are paying are the people who are directing his political discourse. So you can say, follow in the footsteps of the United States. No, my point is, I will agree with the principles, but I'm going to be critical as to the implementation of these principles in the West. And this doesn't mean that we have to Islamize democracy. We have to make democracies more consistent with the very principles we are preaching from within. And I think that this is essential for all of us.
Okay, so here's a question. You're describing all these challenges that we have with Western democracies. We're seeing the economic system falling apart. We're seeing culture here. I mean, last year we had the rioting, and you're seeing a bigger gap between the rich and the poor. Do you really honestly think, our Western democracies are going to last? And should we thus be putting our efforts into working within these structures, or is it time to sort of press the ejector seat and talk about something else? I shouldn't use aeroplane metaphors. Huh?
Yes, it's dangerous. Anyway, no, I don't go that way in my way of thinking about in which way we have to think about politics. I think that within the democratic systems now, what we have to do is really to be involved from within. Just this kind of wait for things to implode and then we'll have a new model. That's not going to work. Now, it's clear that the democratic models today throughout the world, in the West as well as in the Muslim majority countries, have to be reassessed. And we need to find a way of being clear on one thing, is to stop talking about the political structure without talking about all the centers of power. There is no way, and we can't carry on discussing political power without being involved in the discussion about economic power. And all this, just look at what happened in the Arab awakening. For the last 2 years, the only question that we have is, are we going to have true democracies and in which way it's going to be transparent and who is going to lead? That's all fine. But these are secondary questions when it comes to economic stability, who is going to decide? Remember that Barack Obama, when he spoke about just after Tunisia and Egypt, he was saying the half of his talk was about economic support, is that we are going to put money, we are going to support. So democratic powers have also to do with who is financing and in which way it's going to work. So I think that the first attitude is not to think about new models, but to have a new approach, which is a more comprehensive approach of all these dimensions. And I would say it's about the economic factors. My main concern today is what is the very essence of the democratic models if we don't talk about economic justice and economic stability. What is it? And once again, it's not new. It's as old as all what was said during the 19th century by the Marxist approach, saying, stop talking about the political structure if they are not ready to talk about economic dynamics. And I think that this is what we have to do as well, and questioning this.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ismail. I'm from SOAS. And so earlier you were sort of talking about the earlier model sort of being one of resistance and sort of resistance and reformation. And so I guess my question is that if we sort of stay with that logic and we stick to those principles, fairly universal principles, I mean, what if the end result of that is sort of conflict with the surrounding society, as is actually what happened with the case of the Prophet? Or what if and we can even reduce it down to something like activism or, say, struggling for civil liberties, either in Western countries or other countries, you know, I mean, what if the end result of that is conflict and kind of some irreconcilable, you know, difference?
Do you have an example? Irreconcilable difference?
I mean, well, I mean, the example I was thinking of was the one you were using, is the prophetic example of Mecca. I mean, the prophet ended up he had to flee eventually. And so, I mean, I guess the question I'm asking is, when we do that, when we meet resistance from, say, political sectors or economic sectors or sectors within our own community, in your view, what's the best way to go about sort of dealing with that?
I think it's a very good one. Because when we are dealing with ethics, and we understand the very meaning to be involved in our life, at the end of the day, you know, even when we speak about Sharia as a way of being faithful to the principles at the beginning, there is only one way as a human being to live a dignified life, is to resist, because we know how human beings are. Anything which has to do with corruption, oppression, this is going to happen. It's there. And the first to be like this is your own ego, the oppression of your own ego. So resistance is an intrinsic dimension of being a human being. This is why we need to educate ourselves. And the second is not reformation in the way we talk about it in the religious, is to reform ourselves and the world. Islah nafsak wad'u ghayrak, is change yourself and change the surrounding society. When it comes to this, there is something which is clear. If you are serious about this, you are going to face people who don't have the same ethical perspectives and objectives as you have. And it's going to be in the name, you know, anyone who is going to work for peace should be ready to struggle against people who are not ready for that. So working for peace means struggling for peace. It's struggling, it's resistance to all the oppressors. So when it comes to our society, all the Muslims today in the UK, for example, who wants to be good citizens, and they are just trying to be loved by the people around, they don't get it. If you are here to be loved, no, we are here to be respected. And to be respected is to be able to be loyal to your country. But loyal to your country in the name of principles and in the name of peace means to be critically loyal. Is to be able to stand up and to say to your government, I'm not going to accept what you are doing in the name of my country. So this is the starting point of being politicized. Being politicized in the name of your principles is first to start by resisting and to be courageous. Now, some of the people here are British, and they are Muslims at the same time, and they have Christians and Jewish citizens and Buddhists and atheists and whatever. The only common ground that we have is to stand for our principles and to say that there are things that are done in our name that are unacceptable. Are we ready to resist or not? Or do the Muslims today try to find a place where they are loved by the people by being invisible? In politics, to be invisible and to keep quiet, this is a lack of courage. This is not resisting. This is compromising. In this country, you have some of your fellow citizens, they are in jail, they don't know why. They have been extradited to the United States of America in jails where they are going to be tortured or put in situations that's not acceptable. We have people who are sent to wars in Iraq, and why? What are they doing there? And it's not acceptable. There are people in the job market here who are discriminated. That's not acceptable. You have people, when they try to find house, they are discriminated. And not only Muslims, black people today in this country are discriminated. Are we citizens who are ready to resist in order to make this society better? So the starting point is resistance, but there is no resistance without awareness and courage. Courage is the first attitude of people who are dealing with politics. So what is going to be the end of the whole thing in this is not, peaceful and peace and love. It's not going to be peace and love. It's not going to be peace and love. It's going to be peace with the peaceful people. It's going to be struggle with the people who are oppressing, who want only power. And at the end, this is something that we had. The messenger peace be upon him, came with a message of peace, and he had to struggle. People wanted to kill him. So we need to get this from the very beginning. And it's not only with the last messenger. It was the same with Jesus. It was the same with Moses. It was the same with all the people. You know, we are celebrating Gandhi. He was killed. But we are also now celebrating Mandela. Who put Mandela for more than 25 years in jail? After now saying, oh, this is the figure of peace. He was perceived as a terrorist before. So I think that we need to keep this in mind and to understand how courageous we should be.
Hi, I'm Megan. I'm going to LSE, and my question has to do with the recent events in Libya and throughout the Muslim world with the video that was made. So you're talking about taking the values of democracy and making them more consistent. So what? I was actually in Morocco at the time, and I heard a lot of Muslims sort of talking about what is this free speech that allows someone to make a video like this that causes so much trouble. So what is your sort of response to the way that Western democracy deals with free speech versus how critics of what have happened, which obviously was awful, like what would your response in sort of a reimagining of Western democracy be to this sort of situation?
Salam, my name is Farah, and I'm a recent law graduate from Cambridge, and I'm a teaching fellow at SOAS currently. My question relates to a conflict of human rights, especially how do you what do you have to say for religious groups responding to issues stemming from conflict of rights, especially as we have Equality Act 2010, which has, I think, around about 7 protected characteristics. And there have been a recent string of cases where, say, a Christian woman's refused to perform a civil partnership. So my question to you is that if the legal standard in the Western tradition is the separation between law and morality, this legal positivistic approach, how do Islamic groups or religious groups respond to this philosophical debate where it's actually current law now? So all you can do is go to the law courts and say your right to religion versus somebody else's right to equality. So my question is, we can agree on principles of equality, freedom, etc., as most people can, but it's giving content to those principles, such as equality, which is quite different in those two.
Yeah,
that's what
true,
I'm
very much.
asking.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ibrahim. I just graduated from an engineering degree from UCL. So forgive if my question is a little naive. My question is, you made reference to democracy being an implementation of a set of principles, and we can only make it Islamic by making them consistent with Islamic values. And you stated out those set of principles. My question is, must we operate on the same set of universal principles? Because when you take a critical look at the principles themselves, they are not exactly universal. Take, for example, universal suffrage. It is arguable that suffrage should not be universal because the drunk in the street should not be equal in choosing the government, the rulership, for instance, with the sane-minded person. And if you look at each of those principles, you'd see that there are loopholes that could be exploited even in the principles themselves. So must we operate on the same set of principles and just make them consistent with our own values, or we can actually revolutionize everything and bring our own set of principles all together?
Okay, as for the first question about the video and what you saw in Morocco, the first thing that we have to say you started by saying it's awful and it was, you know, meant to be. It's a provocation, and the video was on internet for the 3 months before, and then it was a way of provoking something, and it succeeded in doing so. Now, having said that, and being able to say, you know, we have watched it and say it's so bad in itself and so negative perception, and the message that was there was so low in everything. I think that my reaction to this was first to say we have to be very clear on the fact that freedom of expression, it's a right, and we had some Muslim organizations saying we need law against blasphemy. I'm not going that way. I think it's not the point. So my reaction to this was to say to the Muslims, ignore it. So take a critical distance from this, and if you go on my website, you will see that I wrote 2 articles straight after this. You have them in the English side of the website, responding to this by saying we need to get, and also because I was in the States at that time, I had to respond to media by saying we need to take a critical distance and to look beyond this and not to react to this provocation. Now, by saying this, it's important to understand that some people are trying to trigger this kind of, you know, emotional politics, and they know that it's going to work. Now, we have to say 3 things very quickly. The first is Western Muslims, when they had to deal with this in Denmark, and then in the Netherlands, and then in the States, they were not reacting in a violent way. They are in a setting, they know what is happening. What we have in Muslim majority countries is some trends, sometimes literalists, sometimes populists, that are working on and using this, you know, us versus them. You are more Muslims if you are against the West. And they are indulging in something which is religious populism. And we need to understand that why the people are reacting to this is because they have many other frustrations that are coming, you know, from unemployment, poverty, and when they see, you know, the West with all this, you know, money and wealth and comfortable, ridiculing the religion. And I was also saying to some people in the West, look, you have to get it right. You are criticizing and ridiculing what is in the South the way for people to survive, because the secret for them is what gives them the strength to survive. And then you are sitting here with all your privileges and mocking the people by saying, look at this, and you expect them not to react. It doesn't justify what was done, but it helps to explain why the reactions are like this. From populism to people who are reacting because they feel that they are not respected in what brings or protect their life. Now, the second discussion is about freedom of expression, by saying we have to celebrate and to protect freedom of expression, but we also have to add something. We have rights, and we have to cherish these rights, but there is something which is as simple as having the responsibility of using our rights the right way. So it's a question of, you know, it's not because it's legal or not legal that you can say whatever you want. It's just a question of decency. It's a question of mutual respect. So it's legal, but it's silly. And we have to keep on repeating this. At the end of the day, in pluralistic society, we are not going to live together only by abiding by the law. There is something which has to do a culture of mutual respect, a culture of mutual understanding, a culture where you don't touch something which is sensitive for other people and just say, this is my right to do it. And the last point, just to make it clear, and I was repeating this, you need to understand the collective psychology of societies and community. For example, you know, in the West, in Europe, the way we are dealing with the extermination of the Jews during the Second World War made this experience, this historical experience, reach something which is almost sacred in the way we deal with it. You can legally laugh at the suffering of the Jews, but you don't do it. You don't do it because it's a psychological trauma in the European memory that you don't do something like this. So the way you understand that in the collective psychology, European societies, they don't laugh at this. So when, for example, some Muslims in the Netherlands, to respond to the cartoons in Denmark, did this against the Jews, I say, this is not to be done. You don't answer by doing the same to something which is very sensitive. They wanted just to show that there is double standard. But what I wanted to say by saying this is the way this is reaching a sacred dimension in the European psyche, it's exactly what religion is in the Muslim psyche. It's the same level. We don't laugh at things like this. So it's not because we need law to prevent us from doing it. It's just understand the psychology and the collective psychology, that there are things that are legal, we don't do them because we know it's too sensitive. It's not to be done. So this is my answer. Ignore it, but explain. Explain why. Because at the end of the day, ignoring is good to avoid controversy. But explaining, it's important to live together. It's the only way for us to be able to live together in the future. So this was a long answer for a first question, but I will go about your question, which is important here, is that it's true that in the Western experience, you know, what is legal is not always perceived as moral. So there is a distinction. It doesn't mean that in legal terms, you abide by the law of the country, but you have the right as citizens to be able to express your moral concerns on any things which has to do with the society. So it doesn't mean that you are not going to abide by the law, but I would say, for example, in anything which has to do with the legality of things, that the way we are doing, that I have the right to express my moral, ethical concerns when it comes to this. So it doesn't mean that you act against the law, but sometimes it's the way things are done in legal terms that you have to, or you accept as a citizen, but you don't like as a human being. So this is something which is the right of every single, this is called the freedom of conscience.
So but it's a qualified right, the right to religion. So something like abortion or homosexuality. There was a recent case where a Christian lady refused to perform civil partnership, and it was found against her that her religious right was not, she had to put equality first.
She had what?
She had to put the principle of equality first before her religious objection. So she could express it, she could not act upon it. So
sometimes, but this is something which we all, you know, it's not only for Muslims, it's for Christians, it's for all. Sometimes you have to take a stand on this, that if you decide to go for some position, sometimes you are going to act in the name of the legal framework and what the society is allowing, but you don't agree with this. But this is something that we have every time. As a teacher, sometimes you have to teach things, you don't agree with them, but your role and your duty as a teacher is to teach what is not in agreement with your conscience, but what is part of your duty as a teacher. So sometimes we all have sometimes tensions between our morality and the legal framework, but as a person, as an individual, we can express our concern and our moral background. Now, when it comes to you decided to go for a job, and this job is asking you, and what is requested is for you to do such and such and such duties, you have to do them in the clear respect of your contract, implicit or tacit contract between you and the society. So this means that sometimes we are in contradiction with some of our moral values, It's not always easy. Sometimes there is something which you have, sometimes you can stop by saying, I cannot do this. It could be also, you know, in times of war, we know what is conscientious objection, and it could be in other situations, something that you can say, I cannot do this. You also have sometimes to be able to express this. And by law, it's possible sometimes, and sometimes it's not. So this is where the tensions occur. This is a good question that you ask about. If you listen to what I said, I was not talking about the principles of democracy that we have to accept in all the civilizations. I was saying, if we go behind the principles of Shura even, we'll find that we can find principles in a set of principles that are not at odds with some of the principles that we find in democracy. But I wouldn't say that we have to stop by saying these are the principles and not add other principles. We can add other principles, and I would say from an ethical perspective, we need to have, you know, I wrote a book, The Radical Reform, on this, and there is one chapter where I'm talking about education and power and the state, and I'm trying to extract what could be the objectives and the principles, because I'm not only talking about the principles but also the objectives. Why is it important to get the objectives within the picture? Because by dealing with the objectives, what is called in Arabic al-maqasid, you get something which is a new way to deal with the principles, and not only to say, because this is exactly what you say, what if the principles of equality is putting at the same level people who have no idea about how it works and people who are knowledgeable, which is, by the way, something that we find in an Ahkam al-Sultaniyya when you say the problem with consultation or the dynamic of consultation is not with ordinary people, it's with Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd, people who are knowledgeable about the issue. So you put the people at the same level. But you understand that in some situation, in social situation, it could be the democracy of the elites. And the democracy of the elite is no longer a democracy or is not longer a consultation. So we need to get a sense of what are the objectives that we are trying to reach. So I would say, no, I'm not just saying 6 principles and that's it. I'm saying I don't have a problem with these 6 principles. Now I want to add an ethical backdrop to the whole discussion and objectives to know what we want to achieve. I would say that this is more a way of being critical. But the starting point of our discussion is not to speak about the models, but to speak about the principles, and then because this is a very important question. It's a very important question, especially today when we are facing populism. When we are facing something which is the power of the media that they can change, you know, popular opinions in such a way to say, okay, who is deciding? How are we going to construct this, you know, delegation of power and decision at the grassroots level? Can we carry on doing it the way we are doing it? We might have to think about alternative strategies, but at the same time avoiding something which has to do with the democracies of the elites, because elites are not easy to deal with when it comes to power and money, as you know.
For us, I used to study here. You talked about culture. But in economics, the standard narrative is that free markets, principles of sort of individual liberty and freedom, strong property rights, these are the supposed precursors to economic development based on Christian liberalism. However, there's a sort of counter-narrative emanating from the East, which is that the Eastern economies have developed under a collective, cooperative, fraternal paradigm. The issue is, where is this debate happening within Islam? We actually have the theoretical principle in terms of the ummah. However, I haven't seen any Islamic economic texts or economists discussing at length as to how we can emulate, or rather we can utilize a lot of the lessons learnt from countries like Japan in the late 19th century, or South Korea in the 50s and 60s, or China in the last 30 years, based on
principles of Confucianism. What are your thoughts on this particular issue?
Assalamu alaikum, my name is Kifah, I'm a student here. I was wondering if you have any sort of contemporary examples of the models that exhibit the principles that you've discussed. And I know that you mentioned like the Prophet ﷺ and I know you discussed the Prophet ﷺ and during his time, but like you said, those models aren't necessarily transferable to now. So I was wondering if you have any models now that we can look to.
A country where we can go to and
Not necessarily a country, like
you want to experience hijrah.
No. I'm already on hijrah, alhamdulillah. But I meant like, you know, when you were talking about peace through struggle, I sort of thought of the Zapatistas and how they kind of have a, you know, a model of like, de abajo a la derecha, right? Like from the bottom, they work really organically to create alternative societies. And so I was wondering if you have any sort of models that you would think we could also look to.
My name is Amanda Thomas Johnson, previously of Bristol and Exeter universities. My question is about the current sort of, you could say, the ethics of austerity. So currently in Europe right now, we have governments across the political spectrum who are altering tax rates, altering welfare state provisions. Now, I want to sort of understand where the Islamic principles come into this, because you have a number of perspectives being given. For example, you have some which say that people are too dependent on welfare aid, and so it should be taken away, particularly from the right. You have some which say that people need more. So, you know, how do we sort of join the two sides between sort of self-empowerment, i.e. people going out looking for work themselves and finding a good job, and sort of people being dependent or having some sort of assistance in looking after their children? Maybe they come from, you know, single-parent families, etc., etc. How do you join the two sides together?
Okay, assalamu alaikum. First of all, before I actually get to the question, a side point, I think Dawud al-Zahiri and Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi will have some issue with you talking about the literalists, you know, the application of the term. What you're talking about, what he described quite a few times throughout the talk, would be superficialist as opposed to literalist, but that's another matter. There is, what I'm just saying, that there's a legitimate philosophical literalism, but anyway, that's another matter. But what I was actually going to ask was, I was following on from Ismail's question earlier on, with regard to presenting an alternative model sometimes, you know, criticizing or critiquing certain aspects of the dominant model, for example. Now, the issue is that we're not only facing or attempting to kind of provide this alternative and kind of articulate it, but we're also faced with the issue of what you talked about during the lecture, culture. When a Muslim comes and articulates, let's say, something which is not really that controversial, when you actually come to the theory of, if you talk about the contradictions of democracy, Arrow's theorem, or if you come and talk about you know, the problems which are articulated by some Western scholars with regard to how do we define equality, for example. Which are these are kind of like the things which could be like kind of the tenets or the doctrines of the cult of democracy, or whatever you want to call it. It's when a Muslim comes to question these things in particular, a question mark is put over his head, and it's like, you're saying that because you're an extremist, or you're on step 5 to, you know, of radicalization towards blowing yourself up on a bus or something. You know, or that, yeah. So you know what I mean? Yeah, you're a Salafist. So the thing is, what strategies would you recommend in order to counter this kind of issue of like hegemony of culture with regard to kind of Muslims and the fact that it's a Muslim articulating it, not somebody else, and if it was somebody else it would be less controversial, while at the same time, you know what I mean, because we've got that task, which is the distracting task, and then on the other hand, the substantive task of actually providing the critique and not getting lost, you know, on the other end.
Okay, about what your question about what if it's discussed or not, coming from an Islamic perspective, what has been promoted and the alternative models that we had in Japan and we have now in China, and presented very often as based on the principle of Confucianism, and I think that this, by the way, it's very disputable. It's a rereading of the Confucianist tradition in the Chinese capitalist models that might be problematic, and we had very interesting Chinese philosophers saying, be careful with this, you know, colonizing Confucianism to exploit something which is, oh, we are not following in the footsteps of the American capitalism. Now we have an Asian capitalism with something which is a kind of a new philosophy. We have to study this, but it's quite clear, if we want to be serious about this today, is that there is no real economic alternative model that has been thought or discussed from an Islamic perspective, except from discussing the means. No speculation, no interest, no usury. And that's it. And we call it Islamic economy, or we call it Islamic finance. It's even more dangerous than this, because what we are producing in the name of this Islamic means is in fact confirming the hegemony of the capitalist system. It's even worse than this, because the great majority of the Islamist trends, which started in the beginning of the 20th century as people who were close to the liberation theology approach, are now completely out of this. I wrote a book on the reformist thinkers, and you can see, even with the Muslim Brotherhood, if you read what was done by the first generation of the Muslim Brotherhood with grassroots middle enterprises and being very much against the capitalist system, this was completely lost. And now the new generation of the people coming in the name of the Muslim Brotherhood or in the name of the Islamists, or now what is happening also with Turkey, is very much something which is in the name of the priorities of politics from an Islamic perspective, accepting the imposition of economy and the capitalist economy and the free market. So it's quite clear. And when you read what was produced by transnational corporations and state departments, the way they look and they are reassessing their relationship with the Islamists and the reformist Islamists in the Muslim majority countries is not based on their political project, is based on their acceptance of the capitalist system. And the Turkish experience is quite interesting in this. So, as I'm always putting it, if you are an Islamist capitalist, you are most welcome. You are welcome. And the monarchies and all this, it's something that we know. And I think that this is where there is a lack in our production, in this understanding. So all this discussion that we might have an alternative model today, and when I was writing the book Radical Reform, I put this, and this is why, for example, in our center that you have, by the way, I want you to just to be in touch with us in these 11 fields where we are working on applied Islamic ethics, because on this is to challenge this concept of Islamic economy and to say what would be a true Islamic approach on Islamic ethics in economy, to try to think about alternatives. And it's not going to come only with Muslims. I think that Christians are doing much more ethical, or promoting much more ethical experiences, and some people who have nothing to do with Islam that are very much Islamic without Muslims. That's the problem. And I would say that we have to study these experiences. Now, about where to go in the near future to find the right place to live as Muslims. No, I'm joking. I have no model, unfortunately. I really think that if you look at nations, or if you look at experiences, national experiences, today, based on what we are talking about, ethics in politics and the way we are dealing with economy, I don't see today any Muslim majority country being, or that we can say about it, that this is a model for the future. I can see trends and dynamics and things that are moving, but there is no model. And once again, when it started with the Arab awakening, when I was saying that the young generation of Islamists in Tunisia or in Egypt were much more attracted by Turkey than by Iran. When I then visited Turkey, the Turkish people were very happy to say, yes, you are saying that we are the model. I said, no, you are more the model than Iran, but you are not the model, because there are lots of things that we have to say, lots of things that we have to say about the model. So it's true that they are improving, but still we cannot deny the fact that on minority rights, on transparency, on something that I think, I'm talking to people in Turkey who are saying, be careful, you heard about, this tendency in the Russian model that the one who was the prime minister changed and was a president, and he came back as the prime minister. And then what we have as a discussion in the Turkish model is a prime minister model is going to be a presidential model, and the one who is now the prime minister could end up being the president. And he's a human being. And I would say we have to be very cautious when it comes to transparency to go as far as this. What he said to Mubarak once should be heard by the people who are now in charge in Turkey. One day you have to leave. One day you have to leave. And this is something which has to do with the right political model. When it comes to you end your mandate and you have to leave, and people, new generations are coming. Today, I can see interesting experiences around the world, and by the way, very, very much outside the Arab world. I can see, delegation of power and people who are trying to do things that are interesting. But I cannot talk about any model today, a complete model or a model that is interesting as a political model as such. This is something that I cannot say. Once again, I think that we have to deal with experiences, projects, vision, and but really I have lots of, much concerns about the fact that contemporary Muslims are very, very ready to accept the economic model as something that is an imposition onto them. So we keep on talking about the good principles that we have as Democrats, and we have to show that we are Muslim Democrats as we had Christian Democrats. And so what? If at the end of the day you accept an economic order that is killing, between this morning and tonight, 150 to 200,000 people were killed by the economic system, and at the end, this is invisible. It's something that is not covered by the media, but this much more than anything, any terrorist attack that we have. This is the reality of the system, and it's not ethical. But the Muslims are accepting it as something that it's only in rhetoric terms that we are refusing it. So I would say it's difficult to speak about a model today. The question that you are asking about what should or what could be our position when we see, people who are protesting against the system, and that we see people saying we have to stop with the welfare state, and that the people should not be dependent. In fact, there is a philosophy of life in Islam which is we have to struggle to be autonomous and not to be dependent. But to come with this principle and to say we have to stop the welfare system because it's nurturing dependency of the people because they are not working and they have getting, this is not right. We need to have a comprehensive approach. This system today is not, the welfare state is not a state which is just with all the citizens, protecting the interest and the interest of the rich people and saying to the poor people, you should be independent. So the point here in our discussion is not to answer some of the problems that we have, is to come with a global and overall picture, a comprehensive approach of the whole system. And the whole system today in the West, I'm sorry, if you look at what is happening in the United States of America, and we are told is the biggest democracy in the world, the health care system is just unjust. It was unfair. And with all what he did, Barack Obama had to face what he faced. And still it's not just. So when you see what is done with the banks and how many people lost their homes over the last 5 years, and then still you have people, not only they are getting more money by dealing with transnational corporation, multinational corporation and banks, this is where we need to come not with, oh, is this Islamic? Now we have to acknowledge something, which is going to be our reality in the democratic societies or the Western democracies, something that is new. And it's going to be deeper and deeper in our relationship within the religious community, is that, this unity against, to be unified against a perceived model. Now, when you are a citizen in this country, you are going to have Muslims on the left-hand side of the political spectrum and others on the right side. And we might say, you are my brother, and I love you in Allah, but I'm going to struggle. I'm not going to accept your political views. And, it's very disturbing, really, when you see people who are coming from the South. I'm finishing.
You need to vacate the place.
Okay, so you are cutting me, or can I go quickly?
You need to leave the place in 5 minutes.
Okay, in 5 minutes. So give me 4. So, no, very quickly. So when you have people coming, from a very modest background, they came here out of an economic exile, and then they settled down, the parents, and now they are getting money. They are medical doctors, they are teachers, and now they are making money. And the way they talk about the poor people is exactly in the same terms that their fathers and mothers were treated, and they are becoming capitalists in one way, what we call petit bourgeois, and what they want is the money. So when you have this lack of consciousness, lack of understanding that at the end of the day, if you are here coming with your history, is to never to forget where you are coming from, that there are injustices towards the people of the South. There are injustices with people who are coming to work here. And there are injustices with poor people. And there is racism. One of the main problems that I have. So I don't like just to talk about is this Islamic or not, and that we have to promote independent, autonomous citizens. I want the big picture. And my problem with many of the Western Muslim citizens now is that they are buying the whole project of you being accepted, getting their salary, and not being connected to the poor people. Lack of concerns towards poverty. Lack of concerns towards immigration. Lack of concerns towards people who are in jail in this country. Lack of concern, we don't care. It's as if they are all guilty. There are people in this country who are in jail, they don't know why. It's the same in France, it's the same in the United States. We don't care. Lack of concerns towards racism. You know why? Because there is racism within the Muslim community. This is unacceptable. At the end of the day, we have to come to this. And the last question, very quickly. Give me just, because, okay, what is this? Okay, let me. No, because I don't want to avoid this question. I think that first we may agree or not with literalists. I'm not critical of the concept. I'm saying that we have some literalist trends in the way they are dealing with the text is superficial. I'm not saying that all the literalists are superficial, and this is what I said. They are very sophisticated minds that are dealing with the legal tradition, and you mentioned Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri, which was a great mind. Now, in the way you were talking about something which is essential here. is the way we deal with this, the surrounding culture, and in the way we have to be critical. I think we need to do both. At the same time, it's very much to deal with our own tradition and to avoid this strategic distraction with people attacking you and you are always on the defensive. I'm always talking about this. But now, as a Western Muslim citizen, the critical approach towards the Western model, we need to do this, and this is we have to explain our position as the critical loyalty to our country. Loyalty to the West is not to be blind by supporting the West. And then it's also very important to rely on other intellectuals and other minds that are doing the same. In fact, sometimes we are not heard because we say things and the Muslim qualification of our stand is, oh, you are saying this because you are Muslim. And you have sometimes just, it's a question of strategy. Talk to the people the language they can understand. And sometimes the only fact that you are saying it, you are not the right person to say it. You are not. You are not going to be heard because of where you are. But it doesn't mean that you don't have to say it. But don't say it alone. Don't say it from where you are, and try to find other voices that are saying exactly the same as you are saying. So I think that it's also, communication is part of our problem, is we don't know how to talk to our fellow citizens, and sometimes our perception is, our status is so biased, it's so negative that they are not ready to listen to what we have to say. I would carry on, and I would say we have to carry on this critical approach and talking and talking and talking again, but we need also to think about who in our society can listen, can share, and can do what we cannot do. It's not easy, it's a strategy, and at the end of the day, it's a strategy where you have to think about, it's not only good for me to speak, it's essential for me to be heard. And this is part of what you have to say as well. Thank you.